Hello, and welcome to Significant Figures, Counting and Rounding. Today, we're going to review some ideas on how to count significant figures and how to round significant figures, and hopefully this will fill in some of the gaps from our class today. So remember, we had divided the world into two kinds of numbers: exact numbers, which are not the result of measurements, so they have no uncertainty. They have an infinite number of significant figures, versus most of the numbers we're going to encounter in our class, which are measurements, which do have an inherent level of uncertainty, or a limited number of significant figures. So again, I'm going to point out to you that even though these numbers are exactly the same on both sides, they're representing different things. The numbers on the exact numbers represent definitions with no uncertainty, and the numbers on the right represent measurements, which have a limit to as how well we can know them. So significant figures are the digits in a measured quantity that we know, plus one digit that is uncertain or estimated. We'll see that played out a little bit more in our lab on Thursday, but they are the consequence of a measurement. So there will be a limit to our ability to measure, and therefore a limit to our ability to make calculations. And we'll see that in the next video, how to account for significant figures in calculations. First, we have to count them. So significant figures fall into, or digits really fall into three categories: significant digits, not significant digits, and digits that aren't super clear. So non-zero digits and zeros that are between non-zero digits are significant. The digits that are not significant are the leading zeros. Those are the ones just telling us where the decimal point should be. And we haven't seen too many of these yet, but we will be seeing lots of powers of 10 in scientific notation. So that 10 to the 6th power, those are not significant digits. Again, they're just telling us where that decimal point goes. The ones that are going to give us trouble are the zeros at the end, because it's not always clear if they were measured values and they just happen to be zero, or if we're just using them to fill space and hold, again, hold where the decimal point should be. So we have these guidelines here. Trailing zeros, that's our zeros at the end of a number that have a decimal point in them somewhere. We'll call those significant. And trailing zeros at the end of a digit, or end of a number, those zeros at the end, if there's no decimal point, we will assume that they are not significant. We'll find often that it's helpful to use scientific notation to decide exactly which zeros are significant or not, because it often involves a decimal point, so that helps us to clarify that. So here are some numbers for you to practice with. You'll note there's plenty of zeros, because those are the ones that give us trouble the most. So pause the video and see if you can determine how many significant figures are in each of these following measurements. All right, so here are our results. Check yourself and see how you did. Note this tricky one right here. These two numbers look kind of the same, except the only difference is this little decimal point here. This decimal point makes our zeros at the end suddenly become significant. So that's why this one has 4 significant figures, whereas this poor guy up here with no decimal point, those zeros at the end are considered not significant, so only 2 significant figures. All right, now we have to talk about rounding, because we will be doing calculations, and our calculator is going to help us out with the math, but it is not going to help us out with significant figures. The calculator is just designed to do math, not deal with measurements, just raw numbers. So we're going to have to keep track of that ourselves. We're going to have to be the smart ones here. So you've got 3 options when you put your numbers in your calculator. Either your calculator gives you too many digits, which is very typical, or it has too few digits, which does happen fairly often, and then very rarely your calculator gets it just right. So let's see how we would round things, how we would have to adjust our numbers to report our answer correctly. So let's suppose this is our calculator result, 0.0253601, and we know that our answer is only supposed to have 3 significant figures. So how are we going to round that? I like to count where the significant figures are. Remember, the 2 zeros at the front don't count. I'll count 2, 5, and 3, and that's where I should stop, and then I'll look at what comes after it. What comes after it is a 6, so I'm going to round that up to that 3 up to a 4. So I get 0.0254. If our calculator happens to give us just the right amount of digits, then we can just go ahead and report it as shown. But again, in some rare cases, we get a situation where a calculator gives us a result, 0.025, but we're supposed to have 5 significant figures in our answer. So this one only has 2. There should be 3 more significant digits after that 5. So we have to add in something that's not going to change the actual value of the number, but it is going to add some significant digits. So we put those zeros at the end. Remember, with the decimal point, these zeros are significant, but they're not changing the value of our result. So 0.025000. We would have to add those in to correctly report our answer. So here are some for you to try. Some are going to require rounding and losing decimal places, and some are going to require adding some significant zeros at the end. I've also given you one where we're rounding to decimal places instead of just to number of significant figures, because when we add and subtract, we're going to find that's our rule. That'll be in our next video. So these two here, we're going to be rounding to a position, a place, a decimal place, or a power of 10 place. So again, pause the video if you need to practice this, and then we'll check our results in a sec. All right, here's our results. I've underlined where we were rounding to get the right number of significant figures. So check your results there. There's a couple here, these bottom two, where we had to add some significant digits. There weren't enough. Okay. All right, well, thank you for joining me for significant figures, counting, and rounding. Join me in the next video where we'll deal with significant figures and calculations.